right. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to our talk. Thank you for joining us in the first lecture in our Place Literacy series. This is Sustaining Lake Superior with Nancy Langston. Before I begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement statement. In honor of the Anishinaabe people, the original peoples and caretakers of this land, we would like to recognize that the University of Wisconsin-Superior inhabits the land of Ojibwe people. Please take this moment to honor and celebrate ancestral Ojibwe land and the sacred lands of all Indigenous peoples. Whether we realize it or not, our knowledge of and connection to the places in which we exist and frequent are known to us in ways that shape our understandings of our environments and ourselves. In this series, we will explore this connection as a type of literacy, one that enables us to interact with our surroundings meaningfully. In this Selma Swanstrom Geography Fund lecture, Nancy Langston will explore how communities can sustain Lake Superior and how water literacy foster a sense of place. Please welcome our speaker.
Thanks so much for coming, everyone. And I hope you can hear me in the back there. Great. And after you've told me you can hear me, how many of you have ever heard a loon? Great. And I'm hoping the YouTube audience out there has heard a loon as well. So what we're going to be talking about today are the ways that we can gain greater water literacy and why that matters. And I'm going to focus on loons. How many of you hate loons and want to see them dead? Every single loon dead. Nobody's brave enough to say yes. Okay. And in a few minutes, you'll find out why that matters to this talk. But before we go on, let's listen to a loon for a moment. And I'm going to play it from my phone. It works a bit better. It's one of the calls we're used to. You can hear a bit of the tremolo behind there, right? Yeah, that's the one that people often thought sounded like wolves. They're kind of scary to a lot of people. Let's hear another one. And those are kind of idealized loon calls. I mean, they're real recordings, but they chose adults who kind of knew what they were doing. And this morning, when I was out walking along Lake Superior, over on Romans Point in Herbster, where my dear friends let me stay with them, I listened to two loons, and I won't even do it because you'll just run in horror at the moment. But they felt like they were being there. Have you ever heard that? No. Yeah. We'll say yes. Yes. No. So what happens is out on Lake Superior, we don't have loons breeding. The rare exception of a couple places in the far northeast corner of Iowa, it's really protected. Because loon nests are really vulnerable to waves and water fluctuations. What we do have instead, when you hear loons calling on Lake Superior, those are what are called the floaters, typically males, but sometimes females. And they're the kids from 0 to 7. It takes them 7 or 8 years. And during that time, they have to kind of check out the nesting lakes nearby that don't have too much water fluctuation, see who's doing what in the watershed, and they have to learn their calls because calls are partly inherited, instinctual, but a lot of the call learning is cultural. So they have to listen to each other and they have to practice. So when you hear what sounds like a loon being choked to death, he's probably not being choked to death, or she probably just learning. And they sound as bad as I do when I sing in the shower. So one of the things we learn from loons is that it's not just humans that have to learn things, that we learn from each other, that cultural practices are transmitted are cross generations in loons as well as in people. So one of the things we also know about loons, actually, there's lots of things we know about loons from here. What do you see about its eye?
Red.
Red, thank you. What does that tell us about what season it might be? Any ideas?
Winter.
Close. Sorry, you can tell I taught for 40 years. Close, but wrong. No, great guess. What loon eyes actually turn red during the breeding season, and they are able to switch the physiology of their eyes during the non-breeding season, which is actually really cool. Can you imagine if our eyes were like blue one day and brown the next day? Actually, you probably can't imagine, it's called colored contacts, but if loons don't have colored contacts, they can change their eyes. So we know this is breeding season. One of the other things we see from this is loons are water birds. And that sounds kind of, yeah, whatever, loons are water birds. But the fact that they're water birds becomes really, really important to knowing loons and understanding what loons can teach us humans about place literacy or water literacy. So, loons and water literacy. I was asked to speak today about water literacy. And so that bright red eye, which you can't see right here, but people in many, many northern cultures associated loons with vision and perception, probably because of that bright red eye during the breeding season. One of the other cool things about loons is they can dive extraordinary depths under the water. They're incredible divers, and they have a whole set of physiological adaptations and also cultural adaptations to enable that we'll talk about in a moment. So because loons can dive so far, can swim so well underwater, many, many different northern cultures have associated loons with vision, perception, and with the ability to help humans cross that boundary between life and death, between water and air, between human and non-human. So loons have been the guide for northern shaman on the spirit journeys across these boundaries for many cultures over many, many millennia. So, oops, here we go. So I want to show a short video of a loon underwater because it's harder for us to see. The big red ball. Loons, we heard a story from Jamie, director of the library, about a friend of hers. Well, I'll let you tell that story during question and answer if you want. But loons are really attracted to bright things. Partly they're attracted to each other's bright eyes. They're attracted to this diver underwater with his or her big red ball. But another thing is that we can see loons are able to dive incredibly well. They have evolved really dense, very solid long bones, the tarsus and metatarsus. Don't worry about the technical definitions, but most birds have very light, very buoyant bones, which helps them fly. But loons have evolved these very dense bones that really help them dive down under the water. And then they've also evolved these incredibly amazing lungs that in order to dive, they expel the water from their lungs really fast. And that helps them pierce the water as they go down and down. They flatten their feathers, and that lets them go down 200 feet deep, which is pretty amazing. But they're also really adept at shallow water swimming because their feet. Has anyone seen a loon on the land? Just trying to walk. Yeah, well, they don't like to be seen on the land because they might as well have a huge flashing billboard saying, "Come eat me, coyote or wolf." I'm so uncoordinated on the land. Their legs are very far set back. They're really well adapted to being water birds, creatures of water. pretty well adapted to being creatures of air too, because they have long migrations. But the really cool thing about them is that they can stay underwater for 15 minutes. I don't know how long anybody here can stay underwater without the like 10 seconds on a good day. So what that means is they're actually getting oxygen from their blood rather than from their lungs. Here during their breeding seasons in the northern lakes, they are drinking fresh water, right? We drink fresh water. But they migrate down to salt water, and so they have to completely change their physiology, not just of their eyes, but also of their whole ability to be able to get the water they need without poisoning themselves with too much salt. So there's so many cool things about loons. I could go on for hours, but that's probably enough about loon ecology. Now, let's talk about loon reproduction. I love this little picture about them, little cute. So when you think about, loon mating, what are some of the things that you've heard of about loons? Do they like have 10 mates in a year, go around?
They mate for life.
That's what we often hear.
The babies are on their backs.
You got it. We'll see a really cool picture of that in a moment. Good. Yeah, one of the things we often hear about loon reproduction is they're often put forward as this model of ideal monogamy, because the story, as you just said, is that they mate for life. And we often see them, they arrive at our little lakes in pairs. They typically arrive together. A lot of birds will arrive at different times, the males and females. But loons arrive at the same time, at the same lake where they've been year after year. They've timed it to the moment the ice thaws. That's getting a little more complicated with climate change, but essentially they want to land on a lake that doesn't have ice on it, but very, very quickly. They are solitary nesters, so they nest in big colonies like, say, egrets. They nest right at the water's edge, which makes them vulnerable to nest disturbance, but it also really helps them get their chicks to water very quickly. So they have to choose a lake, hope for the best that it's not fluctuating a lot in water level, but it provides great escape from terrestrial predators, coyotes or wolves or people sneaking over the land. So most lakes, most of the smaller lakes accommodate just one pair of loons. And some of the really very complicated lakes and do have more than one, basically if the loons can't see each other. Because if they start seeing another nesting pair, they get pretty territorial. So it turns out both the male and female help a great deal in nest building and in incubation. The males are spending almost as much time on the chicks, on the eggs as the females, and in taking care afterwards. But there are new technologies now for tracking individuals without disrupting them a lot. And what the ecologists are finding is that loons are really, really attached to their place, to their lake, much more than to the particular mate that happens to be there. Interesting. So if the nesting's going well, they'll stick together. If the nesting's not going well, they'll divorce each other and go find another mate on that same lake. So it's their attachment to place much more than to each other. So they have a within season divorce rate of about 7%, which is actually pretty high. Male floaters, which are the young ones that sound like strangled chickadees, when they're zipping around, if they haven't found a territory of their own that's been abandoned by a dead pair by the age of 8, then they go and do this. You've probably seen this. They're like this chest thing, kind of like, anyway, they're kind of interesting and they're zipping around. I always used to think that was like a mating behavior. It was the male showing off to the female, look, I got a big chest. But it turns out it's male-male behavior, this particular one. And they are trying to seize a territory from an older male, initially without blood, guts, and tears. Well, maybe tears, but they're just like displaying, and the hope is the other male will back off and say, yep, you're right, I'm going to go somewhere else. But often there's a really violent and prolonged territorial battle. And about 1/3 of those efforts by the young, this is most likely the younger one, to get that particular nest site. A third of them end up in the death of the older male. So they've evolved to try and minimize that kind of wounding because if it, leads to the death of all males, then pretty quickly, you don't have loons anymore. But so that's one cool thing about loon behavior, super attached to place. And here's what you mentioned. This is a young chick that was being fed. And then most likely that looks like a small, what do people think that is? Would call it a crawfish. Anyway, some small marine or lake invertebrate. So the cool thing about loons is they're precocious, like most waterfowl, which means unlike, say, your average baby robin that's going to hang out in the nest for weeks, they can swim immediately. They leave the nest immediately, but have no clue how to feed themselves, they have no clue how to stay warm, no clue how to stay away from predators. So they are completely dependent on both parents for the first. Basically, for the first 2 weeks, they stay on one of their parents' back almost all the time. And that's partly because, lakes are full of scary things. Snapping turtles, they don't just get us when we're swimming, but lake trout, pike, big, hungry carnivorous fish, herring gulls, ring-billed gulls, eagles, crows, ravens, you name it. These are tasty, tasty little treats. And so by hanging out on the back of mom and dad, they really, really reduce the risk of predation. But it turns out getting cold is even more scary for a baby loon because they've got some nice fluffy stuff going on. There's a technical scientific term for that, don't worry. But it's really, really hard for them to gather enough energy to resist chilling. So a loon that ends up off, a baby loon who ends up off her parents' back is much, much more likely to die of hypothermia. So they spend 2 weeks hanging out on the back of mom and dad. And then for another 6 weeks, they might go this far away. They're like, Mom, Dad, how dare you get out of my sight? So they stay incredibly close. Mom and dad feed them fish and more fish and more fish and more fish. And by 12 weeks of age, mom and dad are saying, you got to get an apartment of your own. It's not happening staying in the basement anymore, kid. They're really like, you got to learn to fly. So by week 12, they are mostly beginning to forage a lot of their own food. And then at time for migration, so coming, sorry, I know on Zoom, they can't see me doing that. But anyway, so this, they're coming from the North Woods where we are now, can use my thing, and they're migrating. And most of our loons, the story used to be when it was just big banding studies, they would find a bunch of loons that have been born on their natal lakes or baby lakes up here. And then they would spend the winter down, much of the year, down here in salt water. And then some of the loons that breed up in the Canadian and Maine part of the North Woods would go much closer, but they do have to make that shift from fresh water to salt water. And because they're really good at swimming, that means they're pretty good at flying, but they aren't great at flying. So what they do is catch these winds from the west. At this time of year, in the beginning of fall migration, there's some really nice winds from the west, especially from the northwest. So they pop up and they whoosh, they hop in 600-mile hops, basically. They're not flapping those those wings so much. You might have noticed the wings are really, really good for swimming, which makes them not as good for flying. So they're hopping 600 to 700 miles at a time, flying 60 to 70 miles an hour, thanks to those currents from the wind currents from the west. So basically, they're catching those tailwinds out of the northwest. Recently, the USGS started. Yeah, go for it.
I have a question. So
Absolutely.
I read that the parents actually migrate south like a month earlier than the babies do.
Yeah, absolutely.
For their wings to be formed.
It's not completely clear. So the parents do migrate early, a bit before the children, the juveniles, and used to think it was because of the wing morphology, it's the wings a little longer to develop. There's a little confusion about whether that's really happening or not. So open question, thanks for raising that, yeah. So what we do know is that the males or the adults are migrating a bit earlier than the juveniles. And there's been the USGS, the Upper Midwest Environmental Sciences Center, innovated a lot of this work. They're able to do much less invasive tagging that get picked up by satellites across, so they can actually follow where individual loons are going. So this is just the path over several years of one little loon, young loon, born near Tamarack Lake in Minnesota, in Becker Country. So it started up there. Oops, I know I should be gesturing here. Up there, and its first hop was down to Illinois. Okay, that makes sense. Then it hung out for a while, which they didn't really expect. It was like, yeah. And then it hopped down to the Gulf in December in just a couple days. Then it hung out there on the Gulf, enjoying the winter. Then it headed north in May up to Lake Ontario. It's like, wait, aren't you going to come back to Minnesota? And this was a man. It's like, nah, not feeling it yet. So then the next hop was up to the St. Lawrence. It's like, seriously? But this is still a floater. It's too young to breed. And they thought it would just head right back to the birth lakes. But nope, it's just investigating. And then heads back as December is like, Chesapeake Bay, I heard the crabs are great. So I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay. The crabs are great. So it's there for like 4 months, and then it's like, hey, let's head down to the Gulf again. Spends a month down there. All the scientists thought they'd be heading back up, ice is free. And then it pops up to Lake Huron. And then it says, no, I'm missing Lake Superior, heads back over to Lake Superior. Next one, how about Hudson's Bay? I heard Hudson's Bay is something awesome. And then it's like, nah, let's go back to Lake Superior. Nah, let's head back to the Gulf. And then, I'm sorry, it dies. I know, we're getting really invested in this poor loon. But of course, this happens to most juveniles in their first years before they begin to breed. If not, it would be knee deep in loons, right? But the cool thing about this is it turns out individual loons are making really complicated decisions. So let's switch to culture. What can we learn from some of this? So most of us, I think, here love loons, love to hear their call. We don't hate loons, presumably. National Geographic wrote, for many North Americans, loons are much beloved birth, symbolizing the solitude of the Northwoods wilderness with their distinctive haunting wail that echoes over the northern lakes. Some of you probably read that National Geographic article. It's a beautiful photo from Travers. So, these are really powerful beliefs for many of us here who spend all or part of our year in the North Woods. I don't know if you've ever been to Mercer, where there's a huge statue. This is that huge statue, loon capital of the world. It's defined itself. Canada, even its coin is the loonie. I really love loons. But these cultural identities have a really complex history, and that continues to shape the decisions we make about their future. So I remember, mentioned, of course, the loon eye. And loons across cultures are one of the most important animals that can communicate across that boundary between humans and non-humans. So many northern cultures, I've done some work with Inuit, with Athabascan, with Satsum cultures in the north. I've been fortunate enough to work with some Anishinaabe communities that continue to work on loons here in the North Woods. Many cultures believe that in so-called distant time, humans and animals could talk to each other, could understand each other's languages, and could even shapeshift, could become a loon one day, a non-loon another day. And many stories that continue to be really powerful and shared across, for this particular story, across Inuit cultures in the north, suggest some of those deep, powerful past connections. So in this particular Inuit story, there's a little boy. He's a really great hunter. His father dies suddenly, so now he has to really become a really great hunter, and his whole family depends on him in this community. And his mother is cruel. The cruel mother, so many fairy tales and stories. She's not even a stepmother, she's mother. And she's jealous of her son's ability to hunt. I mean, she completely depends on his ability to hunt, but it still really hurts her that he's such a good hunter for whatever reason. And so she blinds him and he can't hunt anymore. Talk about cutting off your hand to whatever. So now he's starving to death, of course. The boy is sitting by the lake weeping because he's lost his vision and he can't hunt to save his family. So a female loon, a red-throated loon in this case, hears his cries. She swims up to him and asks him what the problem is. He tells her. So she says to him, climb on my back, as you see in this picture. Trust me, close your eyes when I dive deep, and no matter what happens, do not open your eyes and do not let go. So he hasn't really been able to trust a lot of the older women in his life, but he says, okay, I'll do this. So she dives down, closes his eyes, she dives back up, and she says, open your eyes. And then she says, what do you see? And he says, nothing. So she said, okay, let's try again. Close your eyes, hold on tighter. She dives down even further and further, comes back up, says, all right, open your eyes, what do you see? And he says, nothing. So she says, okay, this time, really close your eyes. She dives down all the way to the bottom of that fjord, comes back up. She says, open your eyes. And he says, I can see again. And he begins to cry. And the boy says to the loon, thank you. I must give you something in return. What would you like? She tells him, only to know the lake will always be stocked with fish. Only to know you will guard all the gifts of this water. And he says, I will look after you always. I shall treasure this world and all I see. So, in many other cultures, Ojibwe cultures, particularly on Anishinaabe here, the common loon is not just another bird, as important as all birds are, but living loons represent the first act of creation, when the very voice of the creator echoes across the void and becomes embodied in the loon. Norse cultures, Northern European cultures also had really complicated meanings about loons, also associated with that boundary crossing, with the liminal space between death and life. But that became associated for the Norse with demonic laughter, with wolves, with death, and with despair. And so loons began to seem like that wilderness that exists just outside the bounds of civilization. In one particular story, two loons began to battle, and as they fight over their territory, they bring down the entire world, crashing and ruins around them. And so loons still have this association across water, across death and life, but it becomes really terrifying for many Northern Europeans. So when they get to America, with these stories about loons and death and wolves, many new settlers began to hear that cry of the loon, and it sounds to them like the cry of the wolves, which they're equally frightened about. So you probably all heard that early American conservationists were exterminating wolves. If only we kill wolves in Yellowstone, we'll have more and more elk. Have you heard that? Yeah, American conservation was all about death to loons. Do you want a glass of water? Nancy, here you go. So it turns out loons are It's one of our great.
This is one of our great.
William H. Murray. Have you heard of him?
William H. Murray. When you heard
So
of
great. Nobody, I had never heard of him before I
So
started
great,
working
nobody
on this
had ever heard of
project.
him before I
He
started
was
working
the
on this
guy who
project.
almost single-handedly worked with Native American guides
Native
across the
American guides
Adirondacks to bring attention to the
bring
Adirondacks
attention
as a
to the
really special
Adirondacks as a
place.
really
He
special
pushed
place.
really hard
He
for
pushed
the
really hard
Adirondacks
for the
National Park. He wrote his book Adventures in the Wilderness right after the Civil War, 1869, telling people wilderness is not something to be terrified of. It's a home for us. It's how we can recover from this horrific violence of the Civil War. But he also said, those loons, yeah, no. He said they are destroying all we love about wilderness, the fishing experience, predator. So people were supposed to be the only predators out there. So loons, wolves, they were all scary. And the belief was that if you killed them, there'd be more of the animals we value. And in this case, there's an entire chapter about this dude who's a really bad shot, trying to shoot that poor loon. And that's the loon right there. And then, steady there, says the guide. And so eventually, in pursuit of spiritual alignment and a true home, a return to man's natural state, Murray celebrates killing this loon and every other loon he could possibly kill on the Adirondack wilderness. And this belief, was important to much of early American conservation. So this is from Maine. I mean, loons are really big. And there were big derbies, just like we go out doing our fishing derbies. It was loon hunting derbies. And the slogan was always more fish, more fun. How do you get more fish? Kill a loon. I mean, we still do this with cormorants, right? We don't kill wolves. Well, we mostly don't kill wolves so much, but people do kill coyotes still. So there's still this anger at predators. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act passed in 1918 actually made it illegal to kill most migratory birds covered by the act. But 2 decades later, there were still loon killing derbies going on the southern coast. And the cops would come and try and shut it down, and they'd go move someplace else. It was a really pretty powerful part of certain American subcultures. So when finally the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was enforced, it made a huge difference. Took a little while. Passing laws isn't quite enough. It needs to be enforced. But that helped recover populations of migratory birds, including loons, across the US. It was enormously, enormously influential. But stopping human predation didn't deal with some of the bigger threats to loons. And we began to love them to death. So after World War II, there was a lot more money. There was a lot of money invested in building roads, building campgrounds, and in post-World War II Northwoods tourism. Tourism up here had been going on for decades, but the real boom in it required roads and campsites and, lightweight little trailers you could pull behind. So I love looking at the archives. There's so many great posters of come to the north to get away from urban post-war America. And soon that translated not into just a little campsite along a loon, but lakeshore development, initially mostly for summer homes and then more broadly. And you probably noticed there's not a lot of riparian vegetation along this lake. It was bringing with you your own plants, your own ideas of what it ought to look like, nice and tidy, mowed straight down to the edge. And many of our counties now are really trying to help educate and persuade people to slow the flow and restore riparian vegetation. But this, appealed to a certain thing of let's see the lake. And so not only was there tourism, there was creating the Northwoods experience. And that meant, of course, stocking the lake with fish, which in our Inuit story, that's fine. It's fine for human interventions. We don't have to leave humans and nature completely separate. But a lot of folks came up to the Northwoods and said, wow, this is great. It's really nice out here. Who brought this greenhouse? There are all these little bugs everywhere. And so in the post-war era, we had a solution. DDT is good for me. And so we sprayed Northwood lakes so intensely. to make the Northwoods experience more fun for people. And then folks were like, oh, this is great, but there's all this like green stuff everywhere, you know, like algae, and I swim and it gets all over me. Can you do something about that? And so the Aquatic Nuisances Program began in Wisconsin. Very soon afterwards, started spraying arsenic compounds to kill the aquatic vegetation. Took a little while to realize we're also killing fish nurseries. Not gonna be so good for fishing, but that takes a little while. So it started out kind of bubbling along, and then all of a sudden, look at where it is by 1958. It's a lot of arsenic to be dumping in our lakes, right? So it's removing a lot of the habitat that serves as nurseries for the baby fish and crustaceans. And it's also just plain out poisoning a lot of aquatic birds, including loons. But now that we have this wonderful lake without any bugs, without any green stuff to get stuck in, and we also have power boats. And so the sport of water skiing by the 1950s was super popular. And that started creating direct nest disturbances. People didn't realize there was a loon nesting there. They'd come way too close, the splashing up, and it really, really hurt loon nesting sites. And so we had this irony that this increasing love for upper culture all the way to a loon toilet seat led to a loon crash, but it also helped shape a new perception of loons, a determination to save them. And so we started nearly 50 years ago, loon watches across the Northwoods. Our most famous one here was and continues to be run, I believe, by the Sigurd Olson Environmental Institute, at what used to be known as Northern College. And they started a program called Loon Watch to protect individual loons, but also their habitats through monitoring, through education, all these signs everywhere, just letting people know in the hopes that most people didn't want to knowingly hurt a loon, and through a lot of really incredible research program funded by the federal government. And so these efforts have really, really helped stabilize breeding loon populations. This local action, sort of sponsored and using science from from national and international research has made a huge difference. So loons on our individual lakes have been protected by the efforts of people like you and me. But there's always a but. About 5 years ago, the Canadians started doing a survey across Canadian lakes, across Ontario in particular. And what they realized was that this recovery that had been so dramatic until about a decade ago had stalled in many lakes and then even begun to reverse. So loons, for reasons people were like, what is going on? Were again declining. So a huge research project started to try and unravel what was going on. One of the things that was killing loons and has been doing for a while, but is lead fishing tackle, lead ammunition, still allowed to be used in many wildlife refuges and non-wildlife refuges. So there is where it is. That's lead tackle. And one recent study was looking at data up to 2012, but the study came out fairly recently, showed that nearly half of unnatural loon mortality is from ingesting lead. And we completely have the solution to that. Yeah.
Is leaded gas used in motor vehicle boats?
In power boats, not to the best of my knowledge. Yeah. But it turned out that the Polluting for Pleasure was a great book that came out in the late 1970s, in part through the efforts of a set of other initiatives that Ralph Nader actually helped back in the day fund. And what they found out was that pollution, not at that point, it was leaded gas in the water, was actually affecting a lot of nest success. But that was taken out. I mean, somebody might still be able to get some, but it's certainly not generally for sale and you're not supposed to be using. But there's still a lot of lead in circulation. But fossil fuels pose an even greater risk now, even though lead is out of the gas. And we know more about those big events like the BP oil spill because loons are only spending part of their time up here where we're working really hard to protect them. They migrate and they migrate to the Gulf and to the Florida coast. And that's where much of our oil production, our oil drilling, our oil production, our oil storage, or oil transportation is happening. So these really big events like BP oil spill that in 3 months released almost 5 million barrels of crude oil into the Gulf. That killed so many loons because they're down there, they're diving for fish. The fish normally hang out under aquatic mats. They didn't know that this floating oil wasn't an aquatic mat, it was a shadow. And so the loons would go surface, and I had some pictures, and I thought, you don't need to see them. You can imagine, it's really sad. But now a lot of the research funding for the research going on in Minnesota, especially, is coming from a settlement from BP, requiring research to be done on the effects of those big dramatic oil spills. And they're significant, they're real. Loons are carrying all the toxics from fossil fuel production, especially these intense accidents, into our bodies as well, because we also eat fish. But it turns out that it's just the ordinary, it's not the big disasters that catch attention that are so problematic. There's just so much oil and gas and fossil fuels released from ordinary oil production. Millions of gallons of oil are released into marine ecosystems every year, the equivalent of BP, and we just don't hear about it. It's sort of the cost of ordinary production. And that's pretty heartbreaking. But again, we have the technology to change that. Mercury, many of you know, is a huge issue for birds, for ourselves. There was a study done, published, I think, 5 years ago now, just over the border by Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, looking at newborn babies in the watershed. And they found that 9.8, nearly 10% of newborn babies at the moment of birth were essentially Superfund sites. If they were habitat, they'd be illegal. They had levels of mercury that were toxic, well above the EPA limit for toxicity. And I told this to a friend of mine, Casey Huckins, who's a fisheries biologist, because we were writing a grant together to look at some of this. And he said, Nancy, newborn babies of what species? And I said, humans. Yeah, we don't usually call. Well, maybe in ordinary conversation, we might say baby chick is a baby, but it's humans. Nearly 10% of newborn babies in Minnesota a few years ago. And that study hasn't been funded to continue, to the best of my knowledge. So we don't know if that's dropped, if that was just a temporary blip. It's really hard to develop policy from one set of data points like that. But we do know we're at the top of food chains, and loons are as well. So we're bioaccumulating and biomagnifying things that are at really low levels in the water. Mercury doesn't typically kill an adult loon, just like low levels of mercury aren't going to kill us low levels, especially if it's elemental mercury versus methylated, the kind that's really biologically active. But unfortunately, what mercury does is change parental care that many of you know is so essential. So the adults, if they're higher levels of mercury, they don't let the chicks ride on their back. They don't feed their chicks. They don't protect them nearly as much from chilling. The babies, if they have higher levels of mercury at birth, they are much more likely to get hypothermic and to chill and get fatigued and drown or be caught by predators. And so this change in parental care, that when they started monitoring the levels of mercury in the bird's feathers and blood, they started realizing, it's not causing direct mortality, but it is having profound effects on reproductive success. So they found that loons that were nesting in lakes with more mercury compared to lakes with less mercury were actually having half the reproductive success of loons in healthier lakes. And now they're finding that the mercury levels in common loons in our region here is the highest in living animals anywhere in the world, said Mark Pokras, who is the lead author of this study. And again, this was a few years ago. There may be places that have higher levels now. But basically, loons have become a kind of canary in the coal mine. Some of this mercury is coming from local sites, and some of it is coming from distant sites. So much of it, we used to have a lot of our largest point source of mercury in the Lake Superior watershed was from mining. The Wawa mine and smelter up in Wawa on the North Shore, and then the White Pine mine over near Ontonagon were the two really big point sources. They were cleaned up. They're not allowed, well, partially cleaned up. They're not releasing point sources, concentrated sources right into the lake. And that's had enormous benefits to aquatic systems. But we still have we don't have mining as our big source. Instead, we have coal combustion, fossil fuel combustion. And some of that's local. Most of the coal particulates that we had and the mercury is not coming from our local coal plants. It's mostly coming from further away in the lower Great Lakes and the big industrializing areas. So we're bearing both local fingerprints and also fingerprints that loons bring with them on their long migrations, and also that atmospheric currents bring with them. So, and then I had some slides about botulism, acid rain. I took those out because everybody's looking pretty sad. Then there's climate change, just to cheer us all up. Okay. Loons have agency, we have agency. It's not too late to turn any of this around. But a couple years ago, a group of scientists, Jim Kitchell down at UW-Madison, said to a local paper here, and it made a big splash, that Lake Superior is warming faster than any other lake on the planet. Those were the headlines. He went on to sort of qualify that. He said, large lakes, I mean, the little pond in the back of your yards, warming up pretty fast. And we're talking about freshwater lakes, not say the Caspian Sea, but he was trying to get attention and it worked. We are warming. We're warming faster. We're right at the edge of boreal and more temperate ecosystems, with the edge of a lot of ecotones. And many of the boreal forests and bits of boreal forests that so many people have worked on, say here in Superior, they're pushing further and further north. It's not like they're going to go extinct, but they're tracking north. And so trying to figure out what to do about that. Audubon is, sorry, it's probably a little hard to see. Loons are affected by climate stressors, partly because they're pretty well adapted to warming temperatures. They feed a little less when it's too warm, but it's not like moose that really have a hard time feeding when it's warmer. But many of the foods that they depend on start to have some problems. So you can see that they start tracking north. There we are, 2020, 2050, 2080. These are models. This is at higher levels of emissions. We absolutely can change this still. But loons still exist. They're just moving north and they can migrate over some substantial barriers. But our connections to loons in this area may change, but we can still make a difference. So one of the things that's so cool about loons is they're the classic canary in the coal mine. They're indicators of watershed health and of our own health, because like loons, we are immersed in the health of the watersheds. It affects us directly. So I want to end by asking, what can we learn from these loons to help us with better understanding our places, with being more literate about our watersheds? And I think one place to start is with the connections. The idea that what we do to all of those around us, human and non-human, water and not water, comes back inside us. If we're kind to the watershed, we have the chance to be kind to loons and to our future generation. Science is really core to sustaining a healthy watershed. So much of what I just told you very briefly depends on networks of scientists out there literally immersed in the same water and muck that loons are immersed in. So I want to end by returning to that Inuit story. When the loon asked the boy to guard all the gifts of this world, the boy promises, "I will look after you always. I shall treasure this world and all I see." So our task now is to figure out how to do that. as individuals, as communities, both for ourselves, for the loons, and for all the future generations that inhabit this amazing watershed. So thank you. Happy to answer questions, play more loon songs. Any loon stories to share? Any questions? Should have ended that on a more upbeat note. So questions, comments. When was the last time y'all heard a loon?
Nancy, how long do the eyes stay red? How long is that period of the breeding season?
That's a good question. So they're arriving typically in March, April, and then they begin migrating depending on their age. The adults, as you mentioned a month earlier, and the juveniles. So for the adults, it's typically about 4 months, but it can, that's a great question. I'm not sure if they switch just before the adults migration or along the migration on one of their stopover sites. Yeah, but I mean, just how they change that. Turns out I work on reindeer now, and reindeer also change their eye shine, which is so cool, from gold to blue. In the winter, when there's that blue light, their eyes are blue. And then in the summer, when it's brighter, their eyes are yellow. And just like animals that can do that, isn't that amazing? Anyway, I think the most important thing about loons is they are so cool, just like reindeer. And if all we do is, wow, they can dive how deep? I mean, that's such a cool start to loving the loon and treasuring and guarding the world. Thank you for asking that. Other comments, questions? Yeah.
You talked about lead and mercury. Have there been any studies indicating anything regarding microplastics affecting?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are an increasing number of studies showing the effects of microplastics on where they're being accumulated in human brains and human juveniles. And there are some correlations, some associations that we don't know if they're causal yet, between ingestion of fish, which are pretty good at accumulating certain microplastics, but not killing the fish, and then those who consume them. They don't get biomagnified in exactly the same way, but they do get a bit concentrated. We eat a lot of fish. So to the best of my knowledge, there's 1 or 2 studies showing that loons do indeed have microplastics, as you would assume any fish eater does. There are no clear experimental studies or even really clear causal studies that show it's directly affecting parental care the way mercury does. So this recent, and a lot of it's gone on here at UW Superior, and I hope it continues, showing the effects of, microplastics in Lake Superior, microplastics that then make their way up the food chain. But trying to show, does a microplastic do X, Y, or Z? So far as I know, scientists are not there yet. Yeah, but we do know every quart of beer, that's a big, I don't drink beer. What times do we come in? Every pint of beer has how many microplastics in it? Some huge number. It's not quite 1 billion. It's way up there. Just like every quart of water we used to drink here in Duluth and Superior when the taconite processing facility was still going full bore. 1 billion fibers of asbestos per liter of drinking water. Again, that doesn't mean it was directly affecting people, because most of asbestos problems come through your lungs. Nobody really knew what it meant for your stomach. They did know enough to have the Army Corps of Engineers come in with huge water trucks, and eventually, after years of legal battles, shut down the mine processing facility. So we're at that stage right now where people are getting freaked out by how much microplastic in my glass of water. But, loons are exposed to more. Yeah, so I haven't looked in the last year. There might be some studies. Great question. Yeah.
I was just curious, so there's such a cultural connection in the northern areas with loons, but as we know, they migrate and spend time in the Gulf and other places. Are there any of those cultural connections in those southern areas? I was curious.
Yeah, great question. So there were cultural connections in some of the southern coastal areas, and they were associated with the loon hunts. And that's the ones off the coast of Carolinas, off the coast of Georgia, even in the Chesapeake Bay, with these hunts. This is extraordinary bonding time for young men, mostly, and their fathers and uncles. And it was really, really culturally important for African American cultures, white cultures, mostly working class on both. And so it became an easy target. Once conservationists were like, oh, we love loons, we don't hate loons. Oh, those horrible poor people, look, they're murdering loons. So the cultural association of hunting loons as a way to kind of hold on to your identity as young men who know a lot about the ocean, about fishing, about boats, became really powerful because it seemed to be threatened by outsiders who were like, ah, they're killing the loons. But in terms of the other stories, so many of the other stories are associated with those mating calls, and the tremolos and yodels in particular. So my guess is there's much less of those powerful stories about loons as emblems of the wilderness at night, just because the loons are not just off the coast. It can be, I don't, have any of you seen a loon along either the Pacific Northwest coast, the southern coast? You
Down in the
yeah,
golf course,
yeah.
or golf shores, yeah.
Yeah, so they're there, but except for people who are out on fishing boats or oil boats or, out on boats, it's just harder for humans to experience them. So I think that's partly why. Yeah,
Thank you.
Great question. Other
Nancy,
news?
I want to refer back to the mercury thing.
Okay.
Is there any indication that high levels, or did the study that showed that 10% of big babies, okay, was there any follow-up to see what kinds of lifestyle things were involved in the mothers of that kind of thing, or any research to say what kind of mothering was their mother impacted into protection and or feeding?
Yeah, the MPCA, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, did look at it. There have been a whole host of studies on Lake Michigan as well as Lake Superior, Murray Kenwright's lab down in UW-Madison. I was in this lab for a little while. So they were looking at fish consumption. So, and there were huge studies across Wisconsin about the levels of fish consumption, trying to see if there were any associations with how much fish you ate over your lifetime. Some of it's excreted, some of it accumulates. And was there any association with that and levels of mercury in your hair? There were big studies looking at hair samples, some looking at blood samples, but people can clip their hair and send it in. It just costs a lot more to do blood samples. So some pretty clear associations emerged that the levels of fish consumption in the last 5 years were associated with higher levels in your hair for Wisconsin men. And it wasn't that women weren't associated, they were just limiting to men at the time to simplify the study with the limited ones they had, not because they were bad people. They also found that the more walleye you ate, the much higher levels of mercury. So the tribe's Clifford has been Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission then followed up on that study to look at maternal and also paternal, but it turned out it was mostly maternal. What's the word? I'm used to saying this for birds. What the mother, she was developing the fetus inside her, what she consumed during fetal development and for 5 years before, but especially during fetal development, was associated with more walleye she ate from inland lakes, in particular, more lake trout. So the tribes continue to do all this amazing mapping and research that they then pass out to folks, saying the lower you eat on the food chain, the less mercury you're going to ingest. So try and avoid walleye. They pass out walleye maps, mercury maps. Here, there's less mercury in this inland lake of walleye. Here, there's more. And so if you're trying to decide where to go fish walleye, we suggest you choose a lower lake because we know that does affect the maternal consumption during pregnancy, does affect. And then also there's a lot of advice about eat lower on the food chain. So eat whitefish rather than lake trout or walleye or fewer. So there's huge research projects looking at what parents do and throughout their lifetime and how that affects pregnancy, the fetus and the developing fetus. And there's more studies, but they're a lot more complicated, looking at what that means for the children as they develop. What we do know is mercury is not a death sentence. There are all sorts of things parents and young children can do to reduce the effects of that mercury. So if you're born, over the EPA levels, it doesn't mean you're doomed to being a poor parent or having poor cognition. We know that, there's increases in impulsivity, decreases in a whole set of being able to, have certain kinds of cognition. But we also know that better nutrition is huge during the early years of childhood. So there have been a lot of interventions among the tribes, among communities in Milwaukee, say UW-Milwaukee has done so much of this work, and I think UW-Superior has as well, which is just stepping out and helping parents of children affected by mercury, just like lead down in Flint, saying, you haven't condemned your children to anything. Here's an opportunity to get better nutrition in. Here's ways you can help overcome those effects. So I really want to stress, just as with loons, it's not a death sentence. With humans, it's also not you're always going to be, X, Y, and Z affected. There's opportunities for intervention, and they're really with federal funding as well as state funding. There are huge efforts to intervene with affected communities. Now, state and foundation have to step up, to be blunt, because that kind of science and that acting on the information from science, even before it's absolutely final enough to ban mercury, but we know enough to say fruit and vegetables are huge. A low stress environment is huge. Does that make sense? I hate when I used to hear these talks and I just wanted to go jump off a bridge. And the answer is really, we don't have to do that, but we do have to make healthier choices, not just for ourselves, but to make it possible for everyone in our community to make healthier choices. Other questions?
I was just going to add that from an education piece, when you're, because I was recently pregnant, they
Yeah.
give you a lot of literature and like very detailed guides on what fish, how many to eat per week and types. So I think there's been a lot of education in response
Great.
to that.
And those have got so much better than they used to. You all had to go to the EPA fish advisories every time you wanted to bite a fish. And you're supposed to, the EPA had this database, 9,280 some entries, and you're supposed to go in and say exactly where your fish stick from Walmart had been caught. It's like, I have no idea what fish is in there. But it was really place specific, which was great, but it was really hard for people to use. And rather than saying, eat one meal of this a month, it would say, well, there might be X, Y, and Z milligrams per day. And like, what do I do with that? So they've gotten so much better. The Keweenaw Bay Indian community worked with Michigan Tech faculty on this big project called When Can We Eat the Fish? It's like, let's not oversimplify it, but give us usable information. And that's when, also in combination with Glickwick, it was like, okay, let's have maps. When you go do culturally significant practices, we're not going to say stop eating fish. That's stupid. All right, it's not useful. It's so culturally important. We are going to say, here are some maps that might make you have a better choice. Whitefish and lake trout are both really important to Keweenaw Bay Indian community. But during certain times of year, whitefish might be a much healthier choice. Yeah. So there's hope. Science is a core part of that hope. And each of us